Hi everyone, Tom here from Front-End Beginners, and in this video we'll look at how to create a responsive grid layout using CSS Flexbox. The obvious choice for this would be the CSS Grid layout module, but it's entirely possible to create a responsive grid with Flexbox only. For this example, I've created a container div and given it a max width of 1200 pixels. I've also centered it horizontally using a margin of 0 auto. This is simply to contain the other elements in my layout so they don't stretch to the full width of the page. With many Flexbox layouts, you'll create a single parent Flex container and have all of your child Flex items inside it. You then use various Flexbox properties to control how the child elements should behave for that particular layout. When setting up a grid layout with Flexbox, things work slightly differently. Flexbox is designed for one-dimensional layouts, where you control the placement of elements in either a row or a column, not both. As a grid contains both rows and columns, instead of creating a single parent Flex container, we need to create multiple separate Flex containers for each row of our grid. These row Flex containers are then used to control the layout of the grid columns that we place inside them. Let's begin by creating the most simple grid possible, a single row with a single column, or in other words, one grid cell. To do this, inside the container, we'll first create a div with a class of row. Inside our row, we'll create another div and give it a class of column. Just for the sake of this example, inside my column div, I'm going to type the word column. In our HTML, we've now got one row which contains one column. As we discussed a moment ago, to make our grid layout work with CSS Flexbox, we need to turn each individual row into a parent Flex container. So in our CSS, let's target our class of row and set its display property to Flex. Our row is now a Flex container, and any other element we create in our HTML with this same row class will also be a Flex container. Next, we'll target our column class. Just so we can see things clearly in the example, let's give our column a background color of light grey and some padding of 1 rem on the top and bottom. If we look in the browser, we can see our single column. At the moment, it's only as wide as the content it contains, which is the text inside of it, but I want it to be the full width of the row. To do this, we'll use the Flex shorthand property, so Flex, and give it a value of 1. This instructs our column to grow to the full width of the parent container, but it's still able to shrink down in size as the screen becomes narrower. Also, if we were to add in additional columns, as we will in a moment, our Flex1 property will give all of our columns an equal width. As we can see in the browser, our column is now the full width of the row and is able to shrink down in size as the width of the browser decreases. We've got the basic structure of our single row grid set up, so now let's add in some more columns. To do this, we can simply copy our column div and paste it in again below inside the row div. Looking in the browser, we can see that we now have 2 columns inside our row. At the moment, they're not easy to differentiate from one another, as they both have grey backgrounds and there's no separation between them. To fix that, I'm going to use a Flexbox property on the parent Flex container, which is our row, and give it a gap property of 10 pixels. There's now 10 pixels of separation between our columns, so we can see them more clearly. Thanks to the Flex1 property that we applied to our column class earlier, both columns are of equal width and shrink down evenly as the browser becomes narrower. Let's add in a third column just for good measure. So copy and paste our column div once more and see how they always shrink and expand to fit the window and are automatically given the correct equal width inside their row. Now we understand how the columns work, let's add in a second row. To do this, we simply need to create a new div underneath our first row, again with a class of row. Inside it, we need to add our column divs. In this row, I'm only going to use 2 columns, so I'm just going to copy these 2 columns here and paste them in. We now have 2 rows, each containing a different number of columns. I'd quickly like to fix the spacing here so that we have the same gap between our rows as we do between our columns. To do that, I'll give our row class a margin bottom of 10 pixels. We now have the beginnings of a flexible grid layout. The next step is to make our layout responsive. To do that, I'm going to use a media query here for screen only and with a max width of 768 pixels. Whatever code we type inside of our media query will only come into effect when the screen width falls below 768 pixels. For this layout, instead of having the columns become smaller and smaller, where things start to get a bit cramped, I want to have all of our columns stacked one on top of the other at smaller screen sizes. Effectively, on small screen sizes, our grid will be one big column with several rows. On larger screens, I want our grid to revert to its default layout. To achieve that, inside the media query, I'm going to target our row class, which is our flex container, and tell it to wrap all of its content by setting the flex wrap property to wrap. I'm also going to target our column class, and I'm going to set its flex basis to 100%. Now, when our screen width drops below 768 pixels, all of our columns become full width and are stacked one on top of the other instead of side by side in their rows. Let's briefly look into how this works. When we apply the flex1 value to our columns, we're instructing each column to take up an equal amount of free space along the width of the row. If there's only one column, it will be 100% wide. If there's 2 columns, they'll each be 50% wide, and so on. When we give our columns a flex basis of 100%, we override this behavior, and every column will now try to be 100% of the width of its parent container. By default, a flex container has a flex wrap value of no wrap, which means child flex items aren't allowed to wrap below onto a new line, or in other words, every item in a flex container is forced to exist along a single row. When we allow our flex items to wrap below onto a new line by giving them a flex wrap value of wrap, they're no longer forced onto a single row and can expand fully to their flex basis of 100%. That's why, at small screen sizes, we now have 100% width columns that are wrapping below and stacking one on top of the other. This concept can be a bit confusing, so please check out my other videos on flex wrap and flex basis if you'd like to learn more. I'll leave links in the description below. Our grid is now fully flexible and responsive. We have a stacked version of our layout for small screens and the original version for larger screens. I'd like to add a couple more rows to further demonstrate the flexibility of this design. I'm quickly going to update the text in the first row to column third, and the text in the second row to column half. Then I'll add in a third row with a single column and inside it I'll type column whole. And finally, one more row. I'll just copy this column, paste it in, and change this to column 10th, and then I'm going to copy and paste this so that I have 10 columns in total. We've now got a grid with 4 rows, each with a different number of columns. As I reduce the screen width, you can see the columns changing size before breaking into our stacked single column layout for smaller devices. Let's quickly look at what happens when we increase the amount of content inside our columns. In the first row and third column, I'm going to add in some extra text, something like, this column has more content in it than the other 2 columns. Looking in the browser, we can see that the structure of our grid isn't affected by this increase in content. The rows are flexible, and so if one column increases in height, all the other columns in that row will also increase. This allows us to have content of varying widths or heights inside our columns without breaking the flexibility of our layout. I'd just like to cover one last thing before ending this video, and that's creating columns of unequal widths. So far, our columns are all divided into equal widths based upon how many columns we add into each row. If we want a row to contain columns of different widths, we just need to create a couple of new classes and apply a single CSS rule to each. I'll add one more row here to my HTML and create 2 columns inside of it. In the first column, I'll write column 1/3, and in the second, column 2/3. As my first column is going to occupy 1/3 of the row, or 1 fraction of the total available width, its current flex value of 1 can remain in place. This property effectively gives each column 1 fraction of available width, dividing the total width equally based upon the number of columns. As I want the second column to be 2/3 of the width of the row, I'll need to give it a different flex value. To do this, I'll first give this column an additional class of col 2/3. In my CSS, outside of the media query, I'll target this new class of col 2/3 and give it a flex value of 2. This instructs the browser to give this particular column 2 fractions of the total available width inside the row, while the other column is only given the default 1 fraction. By doing this, we're dividing our row into a total of 3 fractions, or 3 slices, effectively giving 1/3 of the width to the first column and 2/3 to the second column. As we can see in the browser, our columns are divided as expected in the desktop layout, but still revert to 100% wide in the mobile layout. This is a simple example of uneven columns, but you can play around with this as much as you like. Just remember that the flex value is proportional. For example, if you wanted one column to be 25% wide and the other to be 75% wide, you could give the first a flex value of 25 and the second a value of 75. Or you could use values of 2.5 and 7.5, or even 0.25 and 0.75. As long as they are proportional to one another, the value itself doesn't really matter. I think that just about sums up the process of creating a grid layout using only CSS Flexbox and some basic media queries. The CSS Grid module should really be your default tool for 2-dimensional layouts, but as demonstrated in this video, it is possible to make Flexbox work for this. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.